Okay, it looks like it's time to get started, so I'm going to introduce our webinar here today. I'm Kate Trams, and this is part of our prevention webinar series with the National American Indian and Alaska Native Prevention Technology Transfer Center. And today we have Ray Daw and Sean Bear presenting on understanding historical trauma in Native American communities. This training series, as I said, is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Prevention Technology Transfer Center. We're part of a PTTC network, which also includes 10 regional centers, a network coordinating office, and the National Hispanic and Latino PTTC. In the next couple of days, we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who attended. This will include a link to the recording, handouts of the slides, and a CEU request form. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEUs for a $15 fee. Immediately following today's webinar, you will be redirected to our GIPRA evaluation. This survey takes just a few minutes to complete and asks about your satisfaction with the event. The feedback is critical to our future work, and we would greatly value your opinion and appreciate your time in sharing your thoughts with us. You will be muted for the duration of this webinar, so please use the chat pod to share your questions and comments, and we'll address questions at appropriate points during the presentation. Our first speaker is Ray Daw. He's a member of our advisory council and one of our major consultants. Ray has been in the behavioral health field for about 35 years, working in the Navajo Nation, nonprofits, and most recently in Alaska. His work in behavioral health has been heavily towards developing Native trauma-appropriate approaches that are healing and effective in tribal behavioral health prevention, intervention, and treatment services. Sean Bear is the co-director of our PTTC and has worked as an administrator and counselor in adolescent behavioral disorder programs, substance abuse, and in-home family therapy. He has experience in building holistic Native American-based curricula and implementing these curriculum and programs in substance abuse treatment and prevention programs. And he's also an Army veteran of 9 years and was honorably discharged from the 82nd Airborne. The 82nd Airborne. Thank you so much, Sean and Ray, and we're so excited to have you both here with us today, sharing and helping us understand a little bit more about historical trauma. So I'm going to pull up your slides here, and then I'll pass things over to you. Quickly before I pass things over, I wanted to mention those of you who joined us for our session last month that was on health promotion. We had an application for applying to do some a supported project if you had a promotion project that you wanted to work on and we could give technical assistance for. I'm going to put the link in the chat to that application because we still have we're still welcoming applications, and we'd love to encourage people to consider that. So I'll put that link in the chat. But right now I'd like to hand things over to Ray and Sean. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I want to welcome everyone. I see we have about 77 people online right now to join us for this brief presentation on historical trauma. On the first slide, I want to give major credit to Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart for developing the historical trauma model about 40 plus years ago, and being a major guide to many of us. We affiliate with her through through a group we refer to as the Dakini Network, and that's the network of mentors and mentees that she designed a few years ago to facilitate discussions on historical trauma. So that's where we're coming from, and Sean is with me and will help with the presentation as we move along. Thank you. Okay. First, the introduction on historical trauma. As I mentioned, it was This model was developed by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart in the mid-1980s. It's a very Native-centric model and has become a premier approach in Native country towards understanding how colonialism has, in most cases, adversely impacted Native populations. And most importantly, addresses ways to adopt Native healing modalities that are healthy and sustained. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking on boarding school trauma, confronting it, and then understanding the trauma, releasing the pain, and transcending the trauma. So that's where we'll be going through on this webinar. We have a standard definition of historical trauma that Dr. Braveheart really emphasizes all of us to develop a grounding on, and it is that it is cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations that emulates from massive group trauma. And if you've looked at adverse childhood experiences and some of the trauma models that are coming out of the Euro-American system, you'll see how it really resonates to this definition of historical trauma that Maria developed in the 1980s. In this model, we talk about the historical trauma response, which is a whole array of features that are in reaction to the massive trauma that Natives have experienced as groups nationally and within tribes and within regions. She observed back then among Lakota people, because she is Lakota, and other Native populations especially, and the similarities between our experiences and the Jewish Holocaust experiences with their survivors and their descendants. And similarly with Japanese American internment camp survivors and descendants. So there's a constellation of responses that occurs through massive group trauma. And some things that's really important to recognize about the historical trauma model is that it's not, the historical trauma is not about trauma only. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. And Maria and I have a lot of discussion about this, how historical trauma is misconstrued to be a discussion about trauma only. The historical trauma model is actually about healing from grief. And it is also about being resilient. That's how Maria teaches. It's what her discussions on the historical trauma model really focus on, is around healing from grief and being resilient. The development of the model, as I mentioned earlier, began in the mid-1980s when Maria came up with the terms historical trauma, historical unresolved grief, HUG, and historical trauma response, and began doing some intervention development, and began doing national presentations that I'm sure a lot of you have heard, and beginning to develop positive response from Native communities across the country. Nowadays in Native country, historical trauma is a fairly common concept and applied in many Native communities, particularly when making applications for grants or developing understanding about the tribal experiences locally and nationally. Then in 1982, she wrote a dissertation and founded TN, which is the Takini Network, and worked out of the University of Denver for a while and finished her doctorate. Why is historical trauma important towards building a case for best practice? Well, I'm sure many of you in the webinar today have developed some understanding, if not extensive understanding, about historical trauma through the many presentations that have been conducted by herself over the last 30 plus years, and also by allies like Josie Chase, Michael Yellowbird from up north, and Bonnie Duran. There are a lot of teachers and mentors on historical trauma who do presentations quite a lot. There's and a good number of journal articles on the topic. And today, historical trauma theory and the Zucchini Network are nationally known. She's in very high demand to do presentations, and unfortunately, she's not able to meet all of that demand on her, and so she asks folks like myself and Josie Chase and others to step in for her whenever possible.
Yeah, and I think something that really backs up this work, I believe, is there was a study came out late last year, was called epigenetic memories. But in that study, they realized and learned that epigenetic memories can be passed down 14 consecutive generations. Mm. So, and when they speak about that, it's like actually like our relatives, their memories, what they've gone through, that trauma is with us. So in a way, it's just like how we've always kind of thought that our ancestors lived through us. So a lot of times when we dance or anything like that, they had remember you're dancing with your relatives.
We began to understand how there was a need for historical trauma theory and the interventions that come from it. From our histories and from the real strong experiences, negative experiences that many of all our tribes have had over centuries of colonization. We have a higher trauma threshold. We have experiences with severe chronic trauma exposure, and the Euro-American psychological system has not been effective at understanding that to meet PTSD criteria. Many of us in Native behavioral health, we believe that these features that we have from historical trauma experiences do meet PTSD criteria. And that exposes a cultural bias in PTSD assessment. 2/3 of Native American youth confirm or affirm multiple traumas, aka adverse childhood experiences, but from that perspective, still don't meet PTSD criteria. There's a need to incorporate cumulative trauma, including genocide over the centuries and racism and oppression as a communal trauma, and adding that into our understanding of complex individual trauma. What are some of the historical trauma features that Dr. Braveheart and those of us that work with her closely discuss? Well, among the primary features is identification of the people who have deceased, passed on ahead of us. We understand that depression is a significant feature in Native country. It's not surprising that in Native mental health surveys and assessment and studies that go on, depression is probably the major diagnosis that keeps popping up across Native country. A third feature that is significant is that we do make strong attempts to numb that pain, and largely through substance abuse. And people wonder why alcoholism and alcohol abuse and alcohol addiction are so significant in Native country. That's a way to numb the pains that we have experienced in our lives and across generations. Suicidal ideation and gestures become a feature. Once again, Euro-American researchers continually wonder why suicide rates among Native people are so high. We understand that through the historical trauma model as a reaction to cumulative trauma responses. Other features include hypervigilance, fixation to the trauma, which is, I think, a reason why when people talk about historical trauma, they talk about the trauma only. That's a fixation. And we try to move that discussion past that, to not fixate on the trauma, but to fixate on the healing. There are somatic symptoms that happen, and I believe that a number of the illnesses and diseases that occur across Native country are psychosomatic responses to cumulative trauma. The survivor guilt is significant, and the heavy amount of anger exists in Indian country that we understand likely comes from historical trauma responses. And of course, psychic numbing, when you're traumatized over a long period of time, you become numbed. And you end up having difficulty appreciating discussions with the creator or spirituality. Those are one of the reactions to historical trauma.
And if you're looking at the genocide, they have definitions of it, but kind of like criteria. But what happened in the Americas, it meets those. And if you look at it, it'll meet those definitions, criteria for genocide. And a lot of times when you're looking at trauma, I know that I've seen some historical trauma presentations out there. A lot of times they show all this negative stuff that's happened all the time, people dying, people being hurt or agony. But if you keep going through that, eventually you do see, especially if you really feel that, you do begin to get angry. You do start to kind of fixate on that trauma and what has happened. So a lot of times when they do that, I can't sit through that. I usually have to walk away.
Yeah. Anger is a normal and natural reaction to traumatic experiences, but it's not healthy to have that anger consume us. And through historical trauma interventions, we work on working through that. Some other features of historical trauma: loyalty to ancestral suffering and the deceased, death wishes, and difficulty modulating or regulating affect. Our feelings get affected. We end up having outbursts of different kinds. We end up being anxious. We have a lot of anxiety that gets expressed. Our self-esteem gets impacted, and then we end up developing victim identity. And when I look at Native country in different areas, I see the victim identity driving how families are and how some individuals are in Indian country. And those aren't healthy places to be. Historical trauma response features, having vitality in life is seen as a betrayal to ancestors. We have respect for ancestors and we see their suffering, and sometimes we see that suffering as affecting us, and then we kind of doubt or wonder why we should be happy. We have compensatory fantasies, like, if I was there, I would have done this. If we were there, we could have done this kind of discussions, and those aren't reality-based fantasies. And we seriously understand that parental boarding school trauma, exist, and that those traumas are passed on to the offspring. The historical trauma interventions under the model has 4 parts to it. The first part is confronting our trauma and embracing the history. Is that black quadrant there. The second intervention that comes with historical trauma is understanding that trauma. What is the impact of all this trauma after we've talked about it, and what what does that impact on our lives? And the third part of the intervention is releasing that pain, the anger, the hurt, the grief. We begin to explore ways of releasing that pain. And the fourth part of the historical trauma model interventions is around transcending that train, being able to live as healthy, happy, compassionate people. When we get to that point and sustain it, then we've begun to transcending that trauma that we've identified in the first intervention. So one of the exercises that I'd like to ask you to do, and I don't expect responses to this, is that, the number of us, myself included, how many of you have had parents who were in boarding school, or if not parents, I think a lot of the younger generations these days will be your grandparents or great-grandparents. And we still have a rolling effect of that upon us. And how many grandparents were also in boarding school or great-grandparents? And those interactions that our grandparents, great-grandparents, and parents had in boarding school, as I mentioned, do impact us today. This is a good exercise to explore with people when we're talking about historical traumas, having begin to understand where some of the traumatic responses began to show up and how they began to impact lives of Native communities. I see Sonia Packard mentioning that her grandfather avoided boarding school, but his sisters went. And that's a really significant separation of siblings. And it affects how some natives were treated, being listed as white and light-skinned enough to get by that way. That's a good example of a historical trauma response. Thank you, Sonia.
If you look at part of that too, looking at being taken away, not being able to speak your language, not be able to practice or learn your spiritual ways and identity, your healing parts, or be able to have that healing within your tribe by medicine people, healers, whatever it might be. It was to kind of extinguish that from us. They wanted to take that away from us, so we wouldn't be able to do that. I know there are different things with teachings and stuff where, like a long time ago, if you look at the calendar, we went by 13 moons, not 12, because if you look at usually once a month out of the year, you have 2 moons in that time period, and really 1. But going to 12 moons, what they say is like putting a turtle on its back. It can't do anything. So it fights there. But part of that healing from it is very important. And that's what they're talking about, like looking at historical trauma almost as a diagnosis and then moving beyond that, not to be stuck there. Because it's like you're going to healing. It's like you're going to a ceremony to be healed of that. And while you're there, you're letting go of it. You're leaving it there for that to be dealt with another way. But every time you go back, in a sense, and picking up this anger again, you're, in a sense, making yourself sick. You're re-picking that baggage back up.
So thank you for your responses, Sonia, and the rest of us that are writing things out. So the first, we're going to go through some examples of how the 4 interventions in the historical trauma model look like. And the first part we're going to look at is confronting historical trauma. When we confront historical trauma, we of course begin to talk about the impact of colonization. We identify colonization as it did happen. It has happened, and it is happening today. And how that has forced migration of a lot of tribes from where they originally lived to other parts of the country. Real good examples are the Cherokee and all tribes were forced to move from their traditional homelands to other places. That's the impact of colonization. And then we have internment. Every tribe that I can think of has an internment experience. And that experience kind of transitioned into what we call reservations these days. And that has an effect on us. And across the centuries, even more recently, there's been repression of our indigenous ways, our traditional ways, and our language, our beliefs, and our identity. I'm seeing a regeneration of that, especially this decade, where we're moving away from that and healing from that repression. And then we have paternalism that has a really negative effect on our people. Paternalism by government agencies, organizations, religious organizations especially, have done a significant amount of damage to Native identity, culture, and spirituality. Carlisle is probably one of the best known examples of the impact of paternalism and forced acculturation and assimilation. There's a slide here that gives some really good information about what happened at Carlisle and how that Carlisle experience moved on across Native country. There were boarding schools as far away as Alaska, where Native children were forced to move from families and placed in boarding schools and made to assimilate and acculturate. And we have Native students that were moved thousands of miles for boarding school experiences. And here are some of the boarding schools that existed in Indian country in the late 1900s. There's a history of boarding schools. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you'll all get the slides later on. You have access to these slides, so you can look at this a lot more closely. But in 1973, there were an estimated 60,000 American Indian children were living in boarding schools at that time. That's a lot of kids. A map of Alaska and where their boarding schools were located. And some of the teachings that went on in boarding school. The brainwashing of like this. Some of the conditions at boarding school, remember, this is the part where we look at confronting the trauma. In confronting the trauma of boarding schools, we understand that family separations occurred, major, I don't know of any boarding school where sexual abuse did not occur. And physical abuse was common. It was a norm in boarding school for physical abuse to go. And many of us who went to boarding school experienced these things directly. There were non-native meals that were given to students, and of course non-native practices. A heavy layer of Christian teachings were put in all the boarding schools, whether they were church-run boarding schools or government-run boarding schools. Native students were made to go to church every Sunday in the federal boarding schools. And with that is emotional abuse and a heavy amount of bullying by Native peers and other students. Regimented standards, you made your bed a certain way, you did GI parties, and young people were made to wear non-native clothing and acculturate that way. And we hear stories of languages being totally discounted and not allowed in all the boarding schools. And it's really contributed to our loss of languages these days, and isolation as punishment. Another scene from a boarding school where everybody's made to pray is very common experiences all the way up through 30 years ago. This happened. It hasn't. So when we're talking about boarding schools, we're not talking about something that's way in the distant past. It's a generation, 2 generations ago. We understand that there's intergenerational historical trauma. We talk about our grandparents and grandparents and great-great-grandparents, and we have many tribal stories about the traumatic experiences of our ancestors. It goes back, and unfortunately, there are a good number of tribes that no longer exist because of genocide. They were decimated. And that's how we begin to understand trauma or confront trauma. What are those really, really bad things that happen? And lay them out. And from that, we go to understanding the trauma. What has been the impact of that trauma on us? And that means we need to understand trauma in many ways as possible. Cultural trauma, of course, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, spiritual trauma, and present trauma. These are some ways of understanding trauma that Dave Bigfoot from Oklahoma has developed as a way to facilitate our understanding of trauma. We are aware that because of the boarding schools in particular, there was a significant forced acculturation. There's a well-known picture of a young man as he was going to boarding school, and the same young man after they cut his hair. His hair was cut and made to wear non-native clothing. These are very common occurrences. Some scenes of what happened to forced acculturation. Students were made to dress and do things that were not necessarily non-native ways of behaving. But also, these were supposedly skills that they could take back to their tribes and their tribal communities and make other family members adopt. One of our understandings about the impact of historical trauma is cultural dissonance. Children in educational systems experience significant cultural dissonance. You see the parents living traditionally, they go to boarding school, and they see a non-traditional lifestyle. And that can cause confusion and negative impact, and does affect academic achievement and personal development of those students. We realize that because some students were not able to cope with or adapt or acculturate to the boarding school system, they died because their personal health and well-being just they couldn't survive, and they ended up being buried and land near the boarding schools. Cultural dissonance does provoke a tendency to resort to ethnocentrism, and we can begin to abandon our own cultural values and adopt those of the non-native culture. It can also lead to misinterpretation of how parents are behaving, and does create misunderstanding about values and norms in schools and at home. These are very common occurrences. And this, there's a reference down at the bottom if you want to look into this a little bit more. We understand that The impact of trauma is across generations, from infancy to adolescence, to adulthood and to elderhood. And because that's how we tend to kind of framework development of people, is through these 4 major life stages. And historical trauma does have an adverse effect across all lifespans. I'd like to show this one because imagine seeing a sign like this on a billboard that is about 10 feet wide and about 6 feet high. And imagine seeing this sign right in the middle of a native reservation, right in the middle of a major intersection on a native capital. This is what existed in the 1950s on one reservation. A sign that big, strategically placed by government representatives. And of course, a major thrust of colonization was to strip traditional belief systems from natives, particularly the young people. And we understand that affects identity very seriously. Cultural genocide existed, still exists today. Another before and after picture, this one of a Cree boy attending Canadian schools. We realized that the boarding school system was not only a United States phenomenon, but was heavily implemented in Canada as well with our First Nations relatives. So from that perspective, we have similar experiences. What have been the impact of the boarding schools? Here we begin to understand some of the impact upon individuals who understand that there's a loss of identity, low self-esteem, there's a diminished sense of safety, there's institutionalized thinking and behavior. People become dependent within boarding schools on a structured system and end up having difficulty adapting to a non-institutionalized setting or lifestyle. You have difficulty forming healthy relationships when you're from within a boarding school and coming out of that. Families, parents lose power because they're not able to communicate in the same way, fashion, or even language that a boarding school student would have. And really created almost destroyed the extended family systems, and some tribes it did. And so these have been some of the impacts of boarding schools. This is how we understand that impact to have happened. Upon tribal communities, the impact shows up as a lost sense of community, a loss of language, loss of traditions and ceremonies. Among tribal nations, weakened tribal nation structure. We have a lot of Native people who are not enrolled in tribes because they were sent off to boarding school and didn't return back to the homelands. There are millions of, if not hundreds of thousands of natives who are not enrolled in the and have census numbers, for example.
Yeah, and if you look at that, enrollment processes and blood quantum, that was placed upon us. That wasn't our way. So a lot of times when they went back in the past, they took rolls at a certain time. And during that time, the people within that tribe, their names are the ones that would go on that roll. So if they weren't there at the time, they might not be counted. So remember, that's something to remember.
Thank you, Sean. Now let's move on to the fourth intervention in the historical trauma model. The third intervention, I should say, is releasing our pain. Now that we've understand the impact of that trauma upon us. And how do we begin to let go of that pain so we don't carry it around in our families and our individual lives? And one of the major ways of beginning to release the pain is through the native practices that we have. This is a really nice tool that the Deep Bigfoot developed in 2008, and she's such a sweet lady. She gave permission for us to use this in our talks. And you see in the center of this framework that Dee developed is spirituality, and what happens around spirituality or to enhance spirituality are all these different practices that we have in a native country. And we do this fully, intentionally, and with purpose. Then we end up having humility, we end up having acceptance, we end up having generosity, we end up having respect, and we end up having acknowledgement of who we are as Native people. And that's what I like about this framework. It really captures the value and meaning and purpose of Native therapeutic practices as we begin to transcend the impact of trauma. Eurocentric practices are there also, and we don't want to discount the Eurocentric ways of helping and healing and recovery that exist from those ways. To transcend the trauma, it's important to be culturally resonant, to be able to relate to the elder or the spiritual leader in the native country. And it's important and valuable to find mentors and instructors in native communities who can guide us, who are willing to spend time that we can learn with. It's also valuable to step into the history and participate in ceremonies and beliefs and practices, begin to understand what they mean and how they're valued by our ancestors, especially. And languages, it's important to go into the language of our people and understand our worldview through language. And there are a lot of literature and teachings out there that we have access to today, that we can adopt and learn from. YouTube has a lot of videos on Native teachings and Native culture and how to be culturally appropriate, how to be culturally resonant, and things like that. But it's valuable to be as good as you can and to be as good as you can be at what you do in the larger society. That's a major teaching within this area. These are some of the types of therapy that are available within the Euro-American system. There's hundreds of them. In the Euro-American behavioral health system, if you go into that system for support and guidance and help, these are some of the ways of helping that can be made available. Once again, some of our indigenous interventions look like this, categorized, and we smudge and use herbs and take herbal tobacco or traditional tobacco and as ways to begin to heal ourselves and move past the grief that we had. There are three ways of thinking that are important, I think, to kind of understand and define. There's treatment, recovery, and healing. And it's oftentimes we hear these three words being used synonymously or as if they're similar, but they really are three different concepts. and they overlap each other too. But this is these are definitions for all of us to be aware of and to think upon as we begin to transcend our trauma. Are we going to transcend our trauma through healing ways, or are we going to transcend our trauma through recovery ways, or are we going to transcend our trauma through treatment ways? That's basically what this slide is about. And the fourth intervention within the historical trauma model is transcending that trauma. After we've gone to understanding where we are and move towards where we want to be as good human beings, the way our ancestors have always emphasized, then how do we sustain that trauma? How do we sustain that healing, or that recovery, or the good treatment experiences that we have? In the Navajo way, this is one of the ways that we understand how we can transcend our trauma. This is a model that was developed by a friend, colleague, mentor years ago as a way for us to understand how we bless our ways of life. And we use Navajo words in this to show our Navajo framework, which includes our sacred mountains and ceremonies and prayers and special healing words that we have. In Navajo, we have the concept of relationships. And all of our native people, we have that concept. And what that concept of relationships is within tribes linguistically differs. Lakota has their phrase for relationships, and this is our Navajo phrase. This is a drawing that was made by a Navajo medicine man, by the way, to show his understanding of in a graphic story. Another way we sustain, transcend the trauma or sustain that healing is by encouraging that we do belong. We are all five-fingered people, and we all are bound to this earth with other human beings. We all have purpose, and these are important things an important concept to grow on and develop. Another teaching that's valuable, leaders, family members especially, is having the capacity to listen. One of the major teachings in almost all tribes is the teaching of listening before speaking or talking, and to think before speaking or talking. This is a major role that listening has with us. I'm always fascinated with the differences between a Euro-American meeting and a gathering and a native gathering. Native gatherings are generally quieter because everybody's listening to each other. In non-native gatherings, they tend to be loud and somewhat unorganized. We understand and appreciate that spiritual grounding and spirituality is a major way of sustaining our healing. Once again, another graphic by the Navajo medicine man on how we understand our spirituality. Our holy people are with us all the time, whether we're at home, whether we're outside, and that's how we're blessed that way. There's a prayer that comes out of the recovery movement, Alcoholics Anonymous in particular, that I think is really nice. A lot of us who aren't in recovery see value in this, because this really resonates to some basic Native teachings. We pray to the Creator, that there are things we have little, no control over, and we ask the Creator to give us peace with these things, to soften our hearts. On the other hand, there are things that we can take on, things that we can change. We ask the Creator to give us strength and energy and courage to change the things that we can really have impact on. And the third thing that comes out of the Serenity Prayer that really synonymous with Native ways, Navajo ways especially, for example, is to have wisdom, that we make good, grounded choices and decisions on how we're going to know the difference between what we have control over and what we don't, and how to move forward with appropriate actions and behaviors and thoughts. So this is a good way to be, I think. Resilience is another teaching that's real important. This is a picture taken about 20 years ago when a grandma came out and joined a protest to ban liquor license transfer, and there's a movement of generations, I remember, to not let this liquor license transfer, and they were so successful at that the license never transferred. And it was because young people and elders got together and said, this isn't good for us. It's good for our families and our people. And we're able to block that transfer. So I really hold this picture as a high regard. But resilience is a major feature of moving forward and sustaining our healing. There's some contact information for you. What I include in here are some Facebook groups and pages that you might want to consider looking at. There are a lot of different avenues in social media to learn. And we have a Facebook page on historical trauma and healing that a number of colleagues, allies, put knowledge on, content. There's one on Native Elder Stories and Teachings, which is heavily Native, Indigenous, traditional, not just United States Native, but Canadian, Maori, African stories and teachings show up there, and then a nice little thing on sunrises and sunsets. So we have a few minutes left for questions if anybody would like to ask a question or give thoughts to each other, share some thoughts with each other. I want to welcome everyone again for joining us. Anyone have questions? Are there specific materials for youth? Sonia asked a question. I think there are national youth organizations that do really good work at discussing the impact of trauma historically on families. Unity, for example, does a lot of good work on this. I know that a good number of Native charter schools have adopted teaching ways to really look at the need, communicating with and meeting the needs of Native youth. So that would be a couple of places I would steer you to, Sonia, in answer to your question. So yes, there are materials out there for youth. Levon Fox asks us, how can you use this information to help decolonize K-12 education? Well, one of the major ways is to have some real thorough discussions about trauma in general and historical trauma in particular on Native youth. And there are a number of school districts across the country who bring into the school system Native liaisons, Native cultural teachers, or Native guides. And those are ways to begin to decolonize the Euro-American educational systems. And there are federal funds that can be used for that purpose also. So once again, Sonia, a place to look at, take a look at Unity research. Yes, I believe, Samuel, you asked a question if the material presented here is suitable for that age range. Yeah, I think so. Feel free to use content here. I'm seeing a lot of typing going on. But at the end of this webinar, you have my email address and cell number. Feel free to message or text if you want to have further dialogue on this after the webinar. And I think we further that discussion there as well if you have thoughts after the webinar is over. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ray and Sean, and I'll watch for some other questions, but while we're waiting for those to finish typing, I'll just remind everyone that we will email all of you, assuming, I mean, you registered, so we'll email to the email address you used to register. We'll send you a link to the recording of this, as well as the handouts and the CEU request form, and so you can go ahead and share this recording if you want to with colleagues. You can view it again, and then yeah, we will have a short survey that we will link you to as we finish out today. If you miss it there, the link to that will also be in the email that we send out.
So everyone have a good day. Take care of yourselves and be happy, and support your other Native peers and support each other. Take care of yourselves is the primary message out of this, okay? Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you, Sean. That was really, really wonderful to hear. And yes, I wanted to share my thanks as well to everyone for joining us, and yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts and your comments, and it was great to see all the people interacting. So yeah, I hope you all have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
I see that Terry Mayo is has a question about hosting a traditional or a historical trauma summit. We can have a discussion on that, Terry, after the webinar. Send me an email. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, with that, I think we'll finish up for today, and thank you all again, and we'll see you soon.
All righty. Adios.
Bye-bye.